I wrote two different introductions for today's show, wildly different introductions, in fact. So, given the topic du jour of free will, I'm going to let you choose the introduction you want to listen to. If you want to hear the very serious, uncomfortable, and dark introduction, stay put, it's coming up. I warn you, it is dark. If you want to hear the thinky, philosophical, lighter introduction, skip ahead about 9 minutes. You got to make your choice, though. Ready? Okay.
BBC Television News now presents a special program on today's mass murder in the capital city. Here is KTBC Television News Editor Neil Spells.
Good evening. One of history's worst mass murders occurred here in Austin today. By official count tonight, 49 persons were hit by gunfire. There are 16 dead and 33 injured. It started last night when a man reportedly killed his wife and his mother. That same man apparently rounded up an arsenal and supplies this morning and then went to the observation deck of the University of Texas Tower. It was then that terror rained down from the tower.
That broadcast is from the fateful day of August 1st, 1966, right here in Austin, Texas, referring to the mass shooting at a tower on the UT campus. An event which is disturbing on two levels. The first, the horror of a mass shooting, is self-evident. A 25-year-old Marine veteran named Charles Whitman climbed a clock tower on the UT campus and for 96 terrifying minutes fired shots at people down below. He killed 15 and injured another 31 before two police officers were able to take him out. Absolutely horrible. An unfathomable tragedy. An act of unmitigated evil. Right? Here's where the second disturbing part comes in. That man, Charles Whitman, had been an otherwise good guy until that point. Many would say a remarkably successful, amicable man, particularly given his background. His father beat the hell out of him as a kid. Abandoned as a child, his dad grew up as an orphan and himself turned into an abusive adult. Beat his wife, beat his children, beat the family dog. When later interviewed, neighbors couldn't recall how many times they had called the police in the 1940s and 50s in response to the horrible explosions of domestic violence of Charles's father. Yet despite a hyper-violent, abusive childhood, Charles Whitman became an Eagle Scout, and at 12 years old, the then youngest Eagle Scout in the BSA's history. He did well in high school, 7th out of 72 students, and 3 days after graduating enlisted in the Marines, where he was initially promising but got himself into trouble, court-martialed for gambling, but, that said, honorably discharged with the rank of Lance Corporal, married a sweetheart, enrolled in an architectural engineering program at UT Austin while working a part-time job. In 1966, his mother called him to say that after 25 years of marriage, she could no longer endure the violence or abuse. And that very night, Charles drove straight to Florida to help his mother pack, despite being so terrified of his father that he asked an armed police officer to wait outside as he helped his mother pack her belongings, then drove her right back to Texas. 5 months later, he would go on to kill that woman and his wife, just before perpetrating what was, at the time, the most deadly mass shooting in American history. Before he left his home, for the final time, he left notes. The first typed, the second handwritten, the third is unlegible, at least to me. And while, again, noting how absolutely horrible the whole affair is, it's not, this is an odd thing to say, it's not the note of an angry man who wants to inflict damage upon the world as a punishment for his own travails, or a punishment for women not taking interest in him, or some kind of narcissistic plot to force the universe to pay as much attention as he believes is his due. Actually, he talks about how much he loved his mother, that she was a poor woman who married a dominating man, never enjoyed the life she was entitled to, how much he loved his wife, that she was the finest wife any man could hope for, that he couldn't understand his irrational thoughts, the increasing mental effort it took to perform normal tasks, the 2 large bottles of Excedrin he'd consumed in the face of mounting headaches, and a request that following his death, an autopsy be done on his brain to see if there was an explanation for all this. And when the smoke cleared, when the bodies from this unspeakable tragedy were removed, and when the authorities did finally examine his brain, they found a tumor about the size of a pecan just above his amygdala, which is, in my view, the second disturbing element of this sad tale. Again, a horrific event, prima facie, but evil guy does evil thing somehow makes more sense to me. But brain malfunction, guy does horrible thing, part of me wonders, actually quite suspects, that Charles Whitman wasn't really culpable for the events he perpetrated, that he was a victim too, albeit of neurology. And all of that begs the uncomfortable question, well, to what extent then do any of our brains really operate in a realm of unobstructed decision-making, of full culpability? The more we learn about brain injuries, the more we realize just how much thinking is done by the brain, which sounds self-evident, but for most of history, we've tended to view the brain as an organ that moves your arms and legs, but the mind as something distinct that relays orders to the brain. It turns out, no. You start poking a pencil in an open brain, tap or electrify the hypothalamus or whatnot, and suddenly you start making very different decisions. It's not just coordinating some ethereal function, it's the function itself. There's a rare but documented condition called foreign accent syndrome, where someone will get a head injury and then, I should have led with this, my God, this is so much lighter. Somebody with foreign accent syndrome speaks whether they want to or not, with an accent, even if they don't know the language. They'll get hit in the head with a brick, or they'll be in a car accident, and from then on out, they will talk like Pepe Le Pew or Queen Elizabeth. Can't do otherwise. If our thoughts are not our own, when our brain is mildly altered by a pecan-sized tumor, to what extent are they fully and independently our own when the brain is working well? If everybody's bundle of neurons is zipping down a track of causality, of hormones, environment, cause and effect, to what extent is your decision ever really your decision versus the sum total of everything that preceded it, which you bear witness to? And if there's no, what we might call free will, what does that mean for society? Going back to the very beginning of today's episode, did you decide to listen to the dark intro option? Was that your decision? Actually, I can answer that. It sounded more titillating, didn't it? It sounded a lot more titillating, and more importantly, you didn't feel like skipping ahead 5 minutes, so you just defaulted on the default order. I would have done the same thing. That's it. If you want to stick around for the alternate introduction, the lighter, thinky introduction, which at least some listeners probably skip to, you are welcome to. And to be honest, I'd encourage you to do so either way as a kind of palate cleanser. The forthcoming guest is a delightful character. We got along real well from the beginning. We kind of joke around. Honestly, I'm going to encourage you, listen to the next introduction anyway, just because I don't want you to go in really focused on mass shooting stuff. I'd rather you think about some other things. Skip ahead if you want to. But otherwise, just stick around and check out the alternate intro. Hello and welcome to the Political Orphanage, a home for people with tiny little amygdalas and engorged hypothalamuses. I'm your host, Andrew Two-Lobe Heaton, and today we're going to talk about free will. All right, welcome to the alternate intro, which you have cleverly skipped to so you don't have to wallow through a dark diatribe about a mass shooting. That was a good call you made. I commend your decision. Or I think I do. Anyway, did you really make a decision? Or do you just feel that you did? Or rather, I should say, Were you inevitably going to make that decision? Was the universe stacked in such a way that you were going to skip ahead, or did you truly exercise will to navigate through multiple options in a universe that could go any direction? Let's talk about Euthyphro. Socrates asks Euthyphro, what is it to be pious? Euthyphro says, well, obviously, pious is that which is loved by the gods. Oh, yeah, says Socrates. So it's just arbitrary then. Whatever the gods like is pious. The gods like purple, so they declare purple a pious color. But it could have been blue, just happened to tickle their fancy. The gods decide to dislike burglary, so they declare it impious, but they could have just as easily said that it is good and upstanding and moral to commit burglary, that everybody ought to commit burglary, and it is impious to respect your parents. Well, no, that's not it, says Euthyphro. That's not it at all. No, murder's inherently bad. Loyalty is inherently good. Aha, says Socrates. So the gods do not have power to proclaim something pious, they just observe that it already is. Glad we've established that morality is something above and beyond the gods. They too are subject to it. But if that is so, what makes the thing innately pious? What is the thing that compels it to be pious in the first place? That's Euthyphro's dilemma in a nutshell. If there is an inherent morality to things whether or not the gods say so, then there is a morality above and independent of the gods. But if they are above morality, if they determine that which is moral, then nothing is inherently good or evil. There's no fundamental good or evil nature to anything in the universe. It's just a function of their ethereal caprice. All right. I swear to God, I'm not high. I'm actually very alert and sober and drinking coffee, and I'm going to bring it on home. Okay, so if you bared with me so far, let's take that same Euthyphro model and apply it to free will, okay? As that is more pertinent to today's program. Obviously, you and I make different decisions in life. Presumably, you make better decisions than I do. Theoretically, let's say you are born into the exact same circumstances as me, with the exact same parents and the exact same genes. In that circumstance, would you make the exact same decisions? If so, if you being born into the exact same place in life with the exact same genes, same circumstances, so on and so forth, if you make the exact same decisions that I would make, then we live in a deterministic universe, in which case there is no free will. All decisions are really just a combination of genes, environment, and circumstance. It's a lot of dominoes falling over, and we're in the middle. But let's say you and I are born into the exact same circumstances, same genes, same parents, same star date, so forth, and you make a different decision. Why did you do that? If it's because you and I have different souls, well, isn't that just kind of saying that we have different genes, but on a spiritual level, that there's something innate that we did not create that compelled us to do that? That brings us right back to where we were. If we'd had identical souls, would we have made the same decision? If not, if we have an identical soul and identical circumstances, genes, star date, all that stuff, would you and I make different decisions? And if we did make different decisions, why? Maybe chaos theory. Maybe that's it. The exact same circumstances but different outcomes. Chaos theory, that something random happens. Okay, that could explain it, but random just means random number generator. We've gone from dominoes to playing dice. That doesn't sound like free will to me. So at what point can we say, this thing I did is different than what you would have done in the exact same circumstances? This is an exercise of free will. It is neither inevitable nor random. Does that exist? If you can figure out how to find free will in the dilemma I just outlined, by all means, post it on the Patreon message board, patreon.com/Andrew Heaton, because I don't like the idea of not having free will, mind you. This is not something that I find pleasant. I don't relish the notion of a deterministic universe. It strikes me as kind of insulting against our dignity, I guess. And the reason that I bring it up on the political orphanage is that it would have some very serious ramifications on things like criminal justice. If there's no free will, if we live in a deterministic universe and you were going to do what you were going to do and you never really made a decision, you're just the sum total of your brain and a bunch of dominoes coming together, it would make sense to shield a dangerous person from the general public. Maybe potentially even to execute them as a deterrent to others, but it would never make sense to punish them, as they could never have done anything else. You could have separation, maybe even deterrence in the death penalty, but it would be immoral if you were trying to make some kind of cosmic justice by punishing the wicked, because you would just be torturing someone who would have arrived at no other outcome anyway. That's the kind of thing we're going to tackle today. Free will, if it's an illusion, and what are the ramifications on society? Before we jump in, one quick piece of advice. Despite veering into Euthyphro's dilemma, the point of today's episode, from my perspective, is ultimately an exercise in public policy, not theology. I'm actually really not interested in the theological ramifications of this personally. I'm interested in how society would operate differently. But for the listeners of the show, for whom the nature of free will is a deeply meaningful spiritual position, I do not want you to feel as though you are under attack or you're being singled out to disprove your religion or anything like that. Today's program is not intended to be a referendum on any particular doctrine within the spiritual space. So if free will is a deeply held belief to you, it is core to your religious identity, then I suggest you treat today as a thought experiment. If there were no free will, what would that look like and how would we reimagine society? And at the end of the episode, I give you permission to take off your thought experiment hat. You can leave it with me and you can return to your normal worldview. But just play around for the next hour with, all right, if there were no free will, what would the ramifications be? What would the universe look like? Sound good? Okay, good. All right, let's get started. But first, The Political Orphanage is sponsored by its own listeners. You know how you regularly skip ahead on the show so you don't have to listen to the commercials? No, you don't. We don't have commercials. This is a listener-supported show, and listeners support it by going to patreon.com/Andrew Heaton. What do you get if you support the show? I'm glad you asked, attractive stranger. You get an additional episode every week, often a bit more casual, if not less sober, and with more swear words. Heaton with his hair down. But mainly, if you think this show provides value, if it makes you laugh and makes you think, please send some value back my way. Head to patreon.com/Andrew Heaton. That's patreon.com/Andrew Heaton. Thanks. My guest today is Dr. Robert M. Sapulsky. He is a professor of biology and neurobiology at Stanford University and the recipient of a MacArthur Genius Grant, which I believe legally means I am talking to a genius. And he is the author of Determined, A Science of Life Without Free Will, which we're going to be explicitly discussing today. You can find that book wherever books are sold, but why not make it easy on yourself? Go to mightyheaton.com/featured, where you can find that as well as every book discussed on this program. Hello, Dr. Sapulsky,
Hello.
legal genius.
Thanks for having me here. And I don't know if the MacArthur people are right or not, but my mother emphatically agreed with them, so that's good.
Oh, but by that case, then I'm legally pretty bright for using our mom's definitions. But before we kick it off, I want to tell you, I don't read a whole lot of scientific books. I tried to read The Elegant Universe a few years ago, and I got a nosebleed and I stopped. So I don't have a good science mind. That said, though, I think this might be the funniest science book I've ever read. You've got an excellent sense of humor, and you're very You're very easy to access in terms of the ideas that you're putting forth, and you've got a real self-depreciating sense of humor that I enjoyed.
Well, thanks. I kind of try. I remember lots of science lectures that gave me nosebleeds, so overcoming that's been the goal.
Great. Maybe it's a genius thing. Maybe the nosebleed is something that I can put in my camp. Well, so the main thesis to your book, which is very extensive and tackles this from almost every conceivable angle, is that we don't have free will, correct?
Yes, not a shred of it.
Not a shred. Okay, so let's clarify this too. Prior to reading your book, what I would have said is you have free will, but it's mitigated. That if you're if you've got a ton of adrenaline, maybe the amount of choices available to you is limited, or if you've got you're limited by definition to the circumstances that you can operate in. So it's not as if you have any possibility in life that you can go through. However, you were saying it's not that we have some amount of free will, or that our free will is curtailed by circumstances or hormones. Rather, there is zero free will whatsoever.
Yes, and what you're describing is this sort of edge case approach. Okay, we have free will, but if somebody has extensive brain damage, you got to keep that in mind if they're sitting at the defendant's table, or if they were brought up with every type of abuse imaginable. No wonder they're not the most emotionally regulated guy and did something. But yeah, that's superimposed on a general picture of free will. I don't think there's any at all when you look closely enough.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we'll get into all of this, but I feel like the first question I have to get out is, I immediately take umbrage with this position, and I don't think it's theological. I feel kind of insulted, or I don't know. I feel as if I am lesser if I have no free will. Did you never have this position, or did you work through it? Do you think that is the position of most folks?
Well, it's definitely not. According to most polls, like 90% of card-carrying philosophers believe that free will is official term compatible with this being a world made up of things like atoms and molecules and stuff, and probably even more than 90% of the lay public. I did not really reason my way to this stance. I had one very disturbed, sort of confused, agitated evening once when I was 14, and woke up suddenly at around 2 a.m. with a huge question clarified in my mind, which was, oh, I get it. There's no God. And then about 5 seconds later, whoa, and there's no free will. And about 5 seconds after that, whoa, and it is a totally empty and different universe. How's about that? So I've
that's a lot to go through at the age of 14. I feel like that's a good 40 years of philosophical stuff to go through in the span of one evening.
Well, as per usual with these stories, I immediately got out a pad of paper and started writing down thoughts. And of course, in the morning, they were incoherent scribbles because I was mostly asleep. But I've been incoherent in that way pretty much ever since.
And when you say that there is not a shred of free will, so that the compatibilist view would be, we do live in a materialist universe where there are atoms and physical laws that are a bit like billiard balls and laws of physics and such. And there's also causality in terms of an action begets a consequence in a big chain. But that we have some maneuverability within this, that we get to precipitate either the probabilities that we go through, or we get to influence some amount of discretion within our prescribed circumstances. But for you, it's more like it's just all mechanical. We're all kind of illusions. We're puppets of the physical universe, but we think that we're making decisions.
That's absolutely the case, and it doesn't require the big dramatic edge cases. Take somebody, stick them in a room, classic social psychology experiment, ask them what their favorite detergent is. And if they've been looking at pictures in the waiting room of the ocean, they're more likely to say Tide, and more likely to then declaratively explain to you why Tide is like the best detergent out there. I mean, starting with that, just all the rest is details, but there's about a gazillion details about that. But like, just start with that, or start with why we're crummy and ungenerous on the average when we're hungry or tired, or start with the fact that people who got raised with by the great grandchildren of like nomadic pastoralists are usually people who are pretty handy with a weapon and have a whole different view about honor than most other people. And from 1 second before to thousands of years before, all we are is the outcome of like the biology, which we had no control over, and its interactions with environment, which we had no control over.
So with the Tide example, I mean, there's lots of different things we can come up with in terms of being able to influence somebody's decisions. There's all sorts of literature in terms of marketing or advertising. You can prime people using particular prompts. So like theoretically, if I'm speaking to somebody and I keep using the word rational, they're more apt to think logically as we progress, or conversely, I'm talking to a Christian and I bring up their religion, they're more likely to be more Christian in their behavior moving on. So that there's definitely ways to prime people. I don't know that would fully negate the free will, though.
Yep.
Like I don't think you could. It would be very difficult for you to prime me to murder somebody. I still have a lot of discretion in terms of my actions, even if you're kind of pushing the galleon in a particular direction. I feel like I still have the ability to steer the ship.
Exactly. And this is because you're taking sort of a classical contemporary science view on free will, which is very similar to the one that goes on in a lot of courtrooms, which is somebody does something, and in a courtroom setting, what you say is, did they intend to do that? Did they intend to do that? Did they know what the consequences were going to be? And were they aware that there were alternative options? And the brain science equivalent is like the most famous experiment of all time in this area from the 1980s, which is you look at somebody and you got their head wired up with every monitoring thing possible, and they tell you the first time they felt an intention to press a button. And you look at their brain scans, and about a second before that, you could tell the brain decided to do that action. Oh my God, the brain decided before you do. And people have been fighting about that one for 40 years since, and like over whether what that means and doesn't mean you've disproven free will. And I think it's the most boring thing on earth, because whether it's in a courtroom, did the person intend to do that? Or in like a lab, did the person intend to do that before or after we could tell their brain was gearing up to do it? It leaves out the only question worth asking, which is, where did that intention come from in the first place? Because if all you're asking about is like, was there intent? Did they know alternatives? When did this happen with respect to milliseconds? You're trying to review a movie based on only seeing the last 3 minutes of it. You've missed everything that got you there to that moment. And when you ask, where did that intent come from? And you really incorporate all the ways in which our behavior is shaped from 1 second before to a million years before, blah, blah. There's no room in there for free will as long as you ask the right question.
Got it. So like when you reference the experiments where they try to neurologically monitor when you start moving your finger to say, I've made a decision, versus when you actually make the decision and so forth. There's some scientific literature that would say you make the decision before you consciously are aware of it. And then we debate, okay, well, does that mean that system 2 as opposed to system 1 thinking is still like, do I exercise free will? Like I was about to argue with you and said, I'm not a scientist, but I have been drunk a lot. And I feel like when I'm drunk, that my brain, even if I'm not consciously doing things, is still reaching for macaroni. And I feel like there's still some part of me that has.
That's it. You just proved it.
What you're saying is it doesn't really, whether it's subconscious or conscious, whether it's limitless or prescribed, that the motivation that I've got, or the urge I've got, that comes from something. And the urge is not something that I will out of the ether. Rather, it's a chain of causality coming from nature and environment.
Exactly. And getting gummed up on this intent thing is like crazy making. It was this guy named Benjamin Libet. And you read any contemporary like biology paper on free will, and it's virtually required by law that by the second paragraph, someone says, all of this stems back to the classic Libet experiments, and they're still fighting about it. There was like a paper published last year. I may have the title wrong, but it was something like Benjamin Libet sucks and got it totally wrong. Nobody fights about like whether somebody's scientific finding from 1983 is still valid. This is like immortality, and they're asking the wrong question, because where did that intent come from? You're a college freshman taking Psych 101, and you signed up for this experiment. Why are you in college? Why are you capable of reading? Why aren't you impaired by having severe protein malnutrition and cerebral malaria when you were a kid? Did your parents teach you to figure out that the grad student is doing you a trick question here with this, and do exactly the opposite of what you think because you have an oppositional personality from the way your brain was constructed? Are you going to steal the grad student's laptop on the way out of the lab afterward? Or do you feel ethically constrained? That didn't come from nowhere. All of these things, the answer is what just happened is because of what just happened just before this, and what happened just before this, and it's all the way down from there.
I will probably mention this in the introduction to today's episode, but your book kept reminding me of Euthyphro's dilemma, which is not really neuroscience, but Euthyphro's dilemma, if I'm getting it correct, is Socrates was speaking to somebody and he was being a dick and provocative and trolling people in Athens instead of having a goddamn job to pay for his kids. And he's talking to a very pious man, and he says, what is pious? And the guy says, well, whatever the gods say. And he goes, well, okay, is something pious because the gods recognize it as pious and they declare it as such, so they're clarifying what is pious, or is it pious because they say it is? In which case, what is the criteria by which they're using it? It would appear to be caprice. And so I've for a long time been thinking about that in terms of free will, of if I'm doing something that is a chain of causality, as you say, that it's not really free will, then it's like, well, is it just rolling the dice? Is it just random? If it's random, then it's just caprice. So what would the actual free will would be? And your answer would be, there is none. It's an illusion. It's causality all the way down.
Yeah. And, we're going to have to get to like the grand, oh my God, please don't bring it up, but let's talk about a quantum indeterminacy. We'll get to that. But in the more conventional sense, where did intent come from? Like, you can identify which neurons just did something, which neurons went silent, and thus your muscles perform that behavior. But you can also then figure out that odors in that room, how hungry you are, how stressed you are, whatever, in the minutes before, would make you more or less sensitive to whatever triggered it. And then you discovered there's a whole world of what your hormone levels this morning had to do with how sensitive your brain is to the stimuli. And then you're back to, were you traumatized over the last 3 months, or were you stimulated? Did you find love? Did you find God? Because that's actually going to have changed the structure of your brain over the neuroplasticity. And then you're back to adolescence and childhood, where all you were doing in childhood was constructing your brain that you have as an adult. And then fetal life. If your mother was stressed when you were a fetus, your brain was pickled in her stress hormones, and that's going to affect how some of the genes in your brain work for the rest of your life. And then genes, and then were your ancestors pastoralists? Were they farmers? Did they live in rainforest? Did they live in, desert? Because that's going to have influenced your mother's mothering style within 2 minutes after you were born. And what kind of species have we evolved to be? Why are we like less monogamous than like marmosets in South America, but more monogamous than bonobos are? And there's like evolutionary explanations. All there are the influences that came beforehand. And really the critical thing with it is, this is not, oh, you can't prove there's no free will with neurobiology, because what about this? Oh, but let's consider hormones or social anthropology. It's not that you need all these different disciplines to plug up each other's holes. They're all one discipline. If you're talking about genes, by definition, you're talking about evolution. And you're also talking about the proteins you made in your brain this morning. If you're talking about your hormone levels today, by definition, you're also talking about what your fetal environment was like. It's one continuous, seamless sort of arch of influences. And when you look at it that way, there isn't a crack anywhere in this edifice that you can shoehorn in free will.
And to finish with the kind of the deductive approach that we're taking, you would say it feels as though I am making a decision, but I cannot wholesale ex nihilo create a desire. That the desires that I'm acting upon, like I might have what appears to be discretion over, do I reach for the donut or do I reach for the salad? but the dueling impulses in me have not arisen from my free will. My desire to eat a donut or my desire to be healthy, both of these are desires that I am acting upon, as opposed to I in a vacuum went, I shall desire this thing.
Exactly. And like Sam Harris, who's like, he both counts as a neuroscientist and a philosopher, and he's probably as aligned with me on this as anybody is. And like, he phrases this great way. You cannot think of what you're going to think next. You cannot wish for what you are going to wish for. You cannot will yourself to have willpower. There isn't that volitional component, and all like the nuts and bolts of like brain cells and ecology, all that does is show you the machinery and how it got there. But those three, you can't wish for what you're going to wish for. You could wish you were more self-disciplined. You could try to will yourself to have better study habits. You could think that you're not going to think about whatever in the next moment, and you can't do it because we're not controlling the buttons.
And then just to, in a moment, I'd like to get into some of the scientific stuff about prefrontal cortex, but just to make sure I fully grasp this, in the same way that I know people that are alcoholics, and we could say, I have more latitude over alcohol than an alcoholic does because I don't have the genetic predisposition towards it. So looking at that exclusively, I might say I have 98% control over alcohol consumption, whereas they've got 50% control. I have more control over myself than an alcoholic has. But you would say basically add up every single thing and you'll find out that you have zero. When you're adding up all the impulses, ultimately everybody has zero amount over the whole picture.
Exactly. And I've sort of developed a hobby in the last decade of working with public defenders on murder trials where there's neurological impaired volitional control, blah, blah, and trying to teach juries about the brain. And they nod their heads yes, and then they go into the jury room and look at the pictures of the corpse and always come back with a guilty verdict. But in terms of that, like, then I do my song and dance, and then the prosecuting attorney gets to cross-examine me, and they always skewer me in the same way, saying, okay, so this guy has damage to his prefrontal cortex that he got in a car accident when he was 10 or so. And like, I take it there's a lot of science that says on the average, you then have trouble with impulse control and emotional regulation. Would every single person who had that exact same lesion have murdered this guy? And I have to say, no, absolutely not. And he said, aha, so it's not deterministic. And I said, yeah, with this much damage, I don't know, maybe you got 40% predictability that this is someone who would do something violent. But let me know, in addition, did this guy grow up middle class or wondering where the rent was coming from for their parents? If you know that, probably about 45% predictability. How stressed was their mother when they were pregnant? Throw that in, maybe you're up to 50%. Did their parents beat them, or did their parents play board games with them? Do they have a variant of this sensation-seeking gene, or do they have that variant? With each added piece, you get more and more predictability. And like actual studies have now shown, know about this gene variant, you get this much predictability. Know about the setting, the socioeconomic status of the person, you're now, and showing exactly that. And at some point, either you have to like say, if there is free will, it's it's getting shrunk into smaller and smaller places, and they're pretty damn boring. Or if you really look at the trajectory of what science does, there's none there. Free will is just what we call the biology that hasn't been figured out yet.
As with many things, you might be right, but I don't like it. I'll tell you why. And I like to think of myself, you've seen Star Wars,
Yes.
right? You know how when the Jedi die, they're Force ghosts? I like to think of myself as a Force ghost that's just sort of operating a meat puppet, and that's what my body's doing. That's how I like to think of myself, right? But when you start getting into the neurology, it raises some very uncomfortable questions. So like, I lived in New York City a few years ago. One of the charities that I volunteered with, I can't remember the name of it, but basically they would help people jog that couldn't otherwise do it. So like I would hold a rope and like some people would jog with blind people, but like one of the guys I jogged with, he'd been in a car wreck. He had, I think it was damage to his prefrontal cortex, but I don't remember exactly. But he had really bad ability to stop and start. So he wanted to jog. He'd been a jogger, but he would take off and he would like run into traffic if he were left by himself, even though he was an otherwise competent individual. So like I would hold this rope and he'd hold the rope and I would basically be like his modulator. And it was a thing where it's not like he just decided to be a dick and run into traffic. It was that literally a part of his brain was damaged that impeded his ability to do stuff that we would normally consider, that we would normally have. And then you start kind of playing that out. Like you brought up a moment ago, the court cases that you'll weigh in on. And typically in society, when we do that, we're making a sympathy plea. But I know from your book that like you also go into great detail of like, look, if your amygdala is enlarged, you're going to be much more, you're going to have a greater fear response. And it's not just that you're of weak character. There's literally, in the same way that if your elbow's broken, you're not going to be able to throw a ball as far. If your amygdala is engorged, you're going to have a different reaction than somebody that's got a shrunken amygdala.
And then you throw in, okay, we're back at, but can you predict that this would be the person who would do it? Start throwing in extra stuff and you begin to see, okay, this person has an enlarged amygdala and we could tell you a zillion reasons why and like the molecular biology of how that happened. Why is it that this person with this large amygdala is someone who winds up like stabbing somebody 72 times in an alleyway when the drug deal goes a little bit wrong? Or why is it that this person is a total son of a bitch maniac when they're playing chess and just takes out the rooks for like no reason or whatever? Okay, it's not just like the brain stuff about this one area of the brain with respect to it's all the other pieces in there. It's not by chance who winds up stabbing people in alleyways and who winds up just being sons of bitches in college debate collegiate bowls or things like that. And, just fill in all those other pieces there.
Can we go through some of the stuff? Because I do find it fascinating. You start to, again, I have my innate Obi-Wan Kenobi Force Ghost view, but the more I learn about neurology, I'm like, there seems to be something to that. So like we mentioned the amygdala. My understanding of the amygdala is that that's a kind of fight or flight part of the brain, and that it's very much associated with fear and with kind of reptile responses, I think. But basically, if you grow up in a situation where resources are scant and you get bullied a lot or you get abused, you're more likely to have an enlarged amygdala because that's an evolutionary response to say like, you need to be able to put fists up at any given moment. And it's actually a rational physical response, as opposed to me being a limp-wristed middle-class kid that grew up in Oklahoma. I probably have a withered amygdala, which is why I do this program and I'm capable of doing this program. But like, am I hitting that? Is that about right with the amygdala?
Yeah. And it's all like threshold stuff. It's all this stuff on what side of a fence are you going to fall? Okay, amygdala. So you're looking at somebody's face, and most people would agree it's not a threatening face. It's not a friendly face. It's kind of neutral. It's kind of ambiguous. And if you have an enlarged amygdala, you're more likely within a fraction of a second to decide that that's a threatening face. That's going to be even more the case if you're male, even more the case if your testosterone levels have been elevated for the last 12 hours. That's even more the case if you're hungry, if you're scared, if you're pissed off. But also, that's even more the case if your brain got marinated in a lot of your mother's stress hormones when you were a fetus. And it's going to be even more the case if you were brought up in a culture of honor where they believe if somebody disses you and you don't go back twice as hard, they're going to come for everything else from you afterward, and this is what's expected of you. And all of those are the things that contribute to it. And on the other hand, if you were like raised, I don't know, double dating with the Dalai Lama or something, you're going to look at this ambiguous face and see the spirituality and the love and the potential in everyone. And if you had high oxytocin levels that day, and if your parents made you feel safe and loved. And it's all this stuff going in there. And when you really look at the bits and pieces that go into it, there's no room in there to squeeze it. Okay, here's the like sarcastic thing. I think I have this in the book. But at some point, like tearing out my hair with yet another philosopher writing about how there is free will and how that's compatible with contemporary science. And like my snotty thing to say is every one of those papers reduces to 3 sentences. Sentence number 1, wow, we've learned so much about the brain, all this cool stuff. Sentence number 2, wow, some of that stuff we've learned about the brain is relevant to volition and challenges our very sense of our agency and free will. Sentence number 3, nah, not really. Like that's basically because somewhere at that point, a rabbit gets pulled out, whether it's quantum indeterminacy or like a dramatic misread of what chaotic systems do, or if it's just like, because I don't want to, because it's like too much of a bummer.
Well, it is kind of it's kind of an affront to my sense of dignity, and it also has a lot of like kind of terrifying implications.
Yeah.
So like if you're correct, then all of the things I'm proud of, I should not be proud of because they're just the result of this chain of causality. Also, anybody we're punishing, we're just doing for the hell of it. Like in any punitive type of criminal justice element, I would think would be unnecessarily cruel because it's predicated on the idea that not that we're protecting somebody or protecting the public, but rather that we ought to meter out punishment as part of, cosmic justice. But if that's the case, then we're just inflicting it on somebody that has, a defective brain.
Exactly. And if you really, really follow through the implications of this, the criminal justice system makes as little sense as burning people at the stake because you think they caused the hurricane. And if you really, really think about it, meritocracy makes as little sense as well, because no one has earned whatever they're getting jailed for or whatever they're getting a bonus for or any such thing. And, that is ultimately the reality of it. And this winds up not just being intellectually bankrupt to say we've got a little man inside our brains who can like read some neurobiology and talks to some of the neurons, but then makes a decision. It's morally bankrupt as well, because we praise and reward and blame and punish people in a world in which none of us had control over the luck that made us who we are. Now, all of that, while I've got that practically into a soundbite that you could like stitch onto a doily in the kitchen, I can function that way, believing that like 1% of the time if I'm lucky. Because, it's hard, and I'm a person of my time and place, and even though I like to think that I'm like a reflective NPR, like liberal, if I was this exact same person 500 years ago, I would have been saying, yeah, like the poor guy. I mean, no one told him to welcome in Satan, so we're going to have to burn him. My mindset is overwhelmingly a sense of agency and this smug, unconscious sense that I should be getting patted on the head because, I went to college, or because I'm like wearing a shirt that looks good today, or something like that. This is incredibly hard. And I constantly demonstrate to myself that I'm a total hypocrite with this stuff. Like I'll be sitting, a few years ago, there was one of these guys who burst into a place of worship with an automatic weapon and mowed down a whole bunch of people because of his repulsive ideology. And listening to NPR on Monday, they say whoever was arraigned today for this horrifying thing, and this is also going to include federal hate crime charges, which makes him eligible for the death penalty. And I think, yeah, fry the bastard. I cannot believe it. And then I think a half second later, wait a second, I'm working on death penalty cases. And no one says the viscera of this is going to be easy because we really, really think that mass murderers are not nice people, or we really think that somebody who would tell the host of dinner that this is the worst meal they've ever eaten. We think of them as bad guys, and we really, really think that Gandhi was a
on the
good
note of the
guy
death
and should
penalty,
probably get
one of the things that you
discounts at
establish in your
restaurants
book
because
is
of
the
how great
difference
it was.
between the
But it
prefrontal
makes
cortex
no
and the
sense
limbic
at
system.
all.
And if I understand this correctly, the prefrontal cortex is kind of the rational part of our brain that does problem solving. It's dispassionate. It's the Spock part of our brain. So when we're in a prison, in a criminal justice context, our prefrontal cortex is deciding whether somebody's guilty or innocent, but it's our limbic system that decides on the punishment. When we go, yeah, throw the book at him, that's our limbic system, which is the more emotional part of our brain, yeah?
Yep. And what this brings up, though, is this very easy picture. Prefrontal cortex is
Wait, what were you
totally
studying?
cool. I wasted 40 years of my life
This
studying
seems a
the
good
wrong
part
part
too.
of the brain.
Isn't
I
that an
should have been
important
studying
thing? If
prefrontal
you're really well
cortex.
adjusted, you got a big
This
hippocampus.
thing
If
called the
you're poorly
hippocampus,
adjusted, it
not
shrivels.
stressed as to the... Yeah. Oh, I don't know. Old age is about regret, but it should have been the prefrontal cortex all along. It's the newest part of our brain to evolve. We've got more of it than any other species. It's the last part that fully matures. And the first pass is that this is our Mr. Spock brain. And it's this top-down picture of your prefrontal cortex reads Immanuel Kant or something, and then tells your limbic system to keep these emotions under control. It's this top-down. But no, when you look at it and you look at what these obsessive neuroanatomists discover, the limbic system can talk to the prefrontal cortex just as much as the prefrontal cortex could talk to the limbic system. What's that about? That's the reason why we don't have Spockian brains. That's the reason why somebody does some totally bizarre, irrational, dumbass thing, like jump into the freezing river to save the kid who fell in there when everyone else is saying, oh my God, you're going to drown. And afterward, they can't explain why they did that. That's because their limbic system overwhelmed their frontal cortex. And in the same way, that overwhelming of the frontal cortex is why we make horrendous, terrible decisions that we regret for the rest of our lives when we're stressed or tired or whatever. And they seem brilliant at the time. And that's also why, if you grew up under circumstances so that you didn't develop a particularly good frontal cortex because of stress, because of this or that, if you spent the last 3 months developing PTSD because of your combat trauma or what, that's why you're going to have a frontal cortex.
And the limbic
that's
system
more
and the
easily taken
prefrontal cortex
over
are
by the
buddies,
limbic
right?
system.
And what I mean by
And
that
a
is,
frightened
I
limbic
don't know
system
neurobiology,
usually.
but I do know a lot of literature within political media and within political science and in sociology. And one of the big findings we've had over the last few years is the idea of motivated reasoning, that we tend to make an emotional decision first, or in the context of politics, we make a groupish decision first. It's very important to people to get along with their group. Truth is rather secondary to most people when you actually get into it. They'd rather get along with their group and avoid social sanction than be objectively correct about the makeup of the universe. For excellent reason. You don't want to be exiled from your group for many evolutionary reasons. But what our brains tend to do is we make the decision first, and then our brain goes into high gear, retconning why we made that decision. And so the limbic system goes, hey, Spock, we've decided we're going to do this today. And Spock goes, cool, let me get the equation explaining why you decided to do that.
Exactly. Just sort of as an aside for people to orient, the amygdala that we were talking about before, that's about fear and anxiety and aggression, is one of the main parts of the limbic system. So that fits in perfectly. That's exactly what you see. And anytime somebody is sitting there saying, I can't tell you why, but that's wrong. When those people do that, it's just wrong. I can't tell you why. That's because that's the moment where the prefrontal cortex hasn't come up with a fake equation yet. when suddenly 3 minutes later they say, oh, I know why. It's because they're clannish. It's because they're scary when you run it. It's because what they did to your ancestors in the Battle of Culloden in 17 whatever. It's because
Never forget.
Exactly, never forgive. Anyway, that my non-Scottish roots, I'm still pissed off about that. But if somebody suddenly comes up with, oh, I just figured out why, that's not why they figured out why, because they didn't figure it out. It's a post hoc, this huge revolution in sort of how do we make moral decisions. And like philosophers have been paid for centuries, built around the idea that we think our way to it. And far more than anybody ever used to think, we feel our way towards it. Beautiful work by this guy, John Haidt at NYU.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I love Jonathan Haidt. Yeah.
He's the best. And he'll do things like you give somebody a moral quandary and they've got to decide what to do. And you have them in a brain scanner and you can see the decision the person is going to make by looking at you can see the decision first in the limbic system. And then the prefrontal cortex comes up with an explanation for it. You can actually see the time course of this. And then you can manipulate somebody so the limbic system works differently and we reach different decisions. Like if you stomp on somebody's toe, they're more likely to lash out at something otherwise. If you raise somebody on the edge of poverty in a neighborhood filled with violence, they're more likely to lash out with somebody. And in both cases, the nuts and bolts of it is you've got like impulsive, ridiculous, imprudent parts of the brain that, because of everything that happened before this and before that and all the way back, have produced with values and intents that might be a little screwy, and the capacity to override the parts of your brain that would say, I wouldn't do that if I were you.
I had on a neurobiologist about 2 years ago and was learning about adrenaline. And I'm going to get this wrong, but I think adrenaline has a half-life of about 10 minutes. And it was an eye-opener for me. I'm not a particularly angry person, or rather I get angry at things. I don't tend to get angry at people. But let's say I get cut off in traffic or something, and I'm really, really angry. I now know I'm just going to be angry for 10 minutes. There's really nothing I can do about it because there's a neurochemical coursing through my brain, and I know that the half-life is, again, I think it's about 10 minutes. And then after that, I'll settle down. And what I can now do when I have some amount of activity in my prefrontal cortex is go, all right, I just have to sit with this for a minute and let this work its way out of my system. Whereas prior to learning about that, I would have thought of it like, if only I had more willpower, I could stop myself from being angry, or I could flip a switch. And it's like, no, this is plumbing going through my brain, and I can't do anything until the pipe's clear.
And if you wanted to like horrify your close friends, you would say at that point, why did I develop a frontal cortex that was capable of saying, remember that thing I read about adrenaline? And remember that I kind of have this respect for reading about science, even though it kind of bores me and overwhelms me. And remember that I'm like not impulsive and I don't have a substance abuse problem. And you remember that I was capable of thinking it would be a good thing to calm down right now. And that's why I was able to stop, that's why I'm not going to cut somebody else off in traffic, 1 minute after this. Where did those things come from? Why did I get a frontal cortex that could do that? Or why did I get a frontal cortex that couldn't do that in a million years? Why do I have adrenal glands that were pouring out adrenaline out the wazoo? Because I grew up learning that novelty is scary. And not everyone can sit there and say, hey, I've read about who reads about that. Maybe you read it in People magazine instead about Hugh Jackman and his divorce or something. You read that and you remembered it and you thought it was a good thing and you were able to incorporate it into your reasoning, and your reasoning at that point was able to have enough insight and declarative reflection on how readily your emotions would just floodgate the system and don't let it. And that's what we are.
So when I was a little kid, my mom good mother would never willfully put me in danger or anything like that. But I remember as a child that she tended to make the relevant distinction in who we navigated towards as boring or interesting as opposed to scary or normal. So like if we went to the barber shop, I was going to get a haircut with whoever had the most tattoos because mom wanted to gravitate towards who was going to provide the most conversation. So based on what you're saying, presumably because I did not have dedicated neurons that were connecting novelty with fear. As a result today, just because of that neuronal structure, I'm presumably going to be less concerned when I encounter something novel. But if I'd been raised where we're in a dangerous neighborhood, if something looks out of place, that is danger, then it's not just psychological in an abstract sense, but I would literally have neurons that are connecting novelty to danger that would exacerbate the amount of adrenaline I experience when I encounter novelty, and I would just have a completely innately different response based on neurochemistry itself.
But the key thing there is innate kind of winds up being a dirty word because it implies you can't change it, so just get accustomed to it. What you proved before is if somewhere along the way you read the right book or you have the right friend or the right, like, almost disaster that you survive or the right person stabbing you in the back and screwing you over, you've changed by like somebody like flips you off as they drive past you. And there's 2.5 neurons there that are now going to work differently because you just opened up a bunch of ion channels in them. And like, with any luck, like it's only going to be 2.5 and you're not going to turn into like a, mass murder as a result because of your cultural needs to revenge and the size of your amygdala and all of that. But none of it is innate in the sense of inevitable, unchangeable. The weird thing is when you study enough about like us as biology interacting with environment machines, what you come away with is seeing just how much stuff can change. The more you see the mechanisms by which change happens, and it's not that by which we choose to change, by which the right, convergence of circumstances change us, the more you see the machinery being exposed underneath. And at the same time, the more grounds there are for optimism, because people are amazingly capable of transformation, for better or worse.
I want to ask you one more question about neurochemistry, and then I want to get into the implications, because that's the only thing I can actually weigh in on this conversation. So, okay, one final question just about how our brains are somewhat mechanical. I'm fairly confident I am low testosterone. My friends and I joke about it, but I'm pretty sure I'm low normal. And I say this, actually, I don't know. I asked my doctor about this a couple of years ago, and he's like, "Why do you think you're low testosterone?" And I was like, I'm pretty conflict averse. I'm not very aggressive. And his response was, "Maybe you're not a dick," which I thought was a really good response from my doctor. But let's say theoretically I'm low testosterone and you started pumping me full of testosterone shots. How would that influence my psychological? Would I go pick fights with people? Would I go to the biker bar and just start swinging punches? Like, how would it, is it just affecting probabilities, or is it like a certainty I'm going to be more aggressive? What would happen?
Well, that's like the perfect question. And the follow-up question to your doctor when he said, well, maybe you're not a dick, is to say, why didn't I develop into being a dick? Why am I not one? And somewhere in there, testosterone is going to come in, but somewhere in there also lullabies when you were a baby and
hanging out with those tattooed dudes at the barbershop with my mom.
Exactly.
Apparently that really helped. Thanks, Mom.
Well, I can see somewhat down your neckline and sort of from your mid-arms down, and I don't see any tattoos. So something paradoxical happened or didn't happen there. But okay, so you have elevated testosterone levels. Is that going to make you more aggressive? And the answer is, it depends. You take like 5 rhesus monkeys, male rhesus monkeys, throw them together in a group, and they're going to work out a dominance hierarchy where number 1 trounces 2 through 4, and number 2 trounces 3 through 5, and 2 through 5 and 3 through 5. And like, you look at what they've been doing for the last 6 months, and number 2 always trounces 3, 4, and 5 and never does it to number 1. But now you take number 3 and shoot him up with testosterone. Shoot him up with like so much, like his amygdala is growing antlers or something, massive amounts. Is he going to be involved in more fights? Yeah. Whoa, testosterone causes aggression, endocrine determinism and inevitability and fate and all of that. But then you look closely. Does this mean that number 3 is now challenging number 2 and number 1 and in their faces and maybe taking them down? No. He never goes anywhere near 2 and 1. He's just being an unbelievable dick now to numbers 4 and 5. He's hassling them. What has happened? Has testosterone created new patterns of aggression? No, it's just amplified his social learning of aggression. It just upped the volume of what was already there. And you see that with like an experiment that's been done for 20,000 years on like ornery farm animals and human, recalcitrant, violent criminals and stuff, where you castrate them or chemically castrate them. And what a massive literature shows is, levels of aggression go down, whether you're looking at like brine shrimp or like guys on death row in Louisiana. Aggression goes down, but it doesn't go down to 0. And how much aggression remains afterward, it depends. How much experience did you have being aggressive beforehand? How much of it is now being carried by social learning and temperament and personality and has squat to do with how many of these molecules are in your bloodstream? Yeah, testosterone is just finessing what all those other influences have handed you.
So theoretically, let's say in my in-group, you can be belligerent to MAGA Republicans with impunity, or you can be belligerent to progressive Democrats with impunity. Testosterone would probably not alter my relationship with people in my in-group, or at least people that I view as my superiors, but I'm going to be a dick to the out-group now, or to people that I view as my subordinates.
Absolutely. And within the framework of what your like cultural values are and what testosterone might make you do, I don't know, maybe sit around and play Settlers of Catan or something with your friends. And this guy, he's your cousin, he's a nice, but you're going to cut off that son of a bitch before he gets to that like sheep port or something. And why was that? Because, it's the time of day where my circadian rhythm of testosterone levels happen to be on the high side, and your liver happened to make a lot of these transport molecules that deliver testosterone to your brain, and because your blood glucose levels are at this level instead of that, and because like your mother never got along with your cousin's mother and you have some residual and all of it. But within the world that you had your brain constructed in, that takes the form of you being like a jerk at the board game instead of like doing a drive-by shooting, or instead of deciding to invade their country or something. And like, World War I was all about cousins invading each other's countries, the various monarchs there. Okay, if they had had a different sort of upbringing, maybe the Tsar would have been a jerk playing Settlers of Catan with the King of England or something. It's context. Biology gives you the template, and what environment then does is tell you the direction that template is going to go, and with what sort of volume.
I'd like to get into implications now. Following you so far, it sounds like kind of the idea of people make bad decisions because they have poor character is very abstract, or at best is describing an underlying neurological condition, and that looking down at somebody with poor impulse control is the neurological equivalent of getting mad at somebody for not winning the race because their legs are short. That
Exactly.
Ultimately there are if I having been raised in a pleasant, like my friends joke that somebody shook a Norman Rockwell painting and I fell out. So as a result, I probably have just a beautiful hippocampus, and I have low adrenaline and testosterone levels, and thus very unlikely to ever be one of those people that freaks out in a video on Reddit where somebody gets mad on an airplane. I'm probably not going to happen, right? But those people who do, they might have a different neurological construct that would be like if you flooded somebody's system with adrenaline or whatever. I follow you so far. Should we tell anybody? Because I'm a bit worried if we tell everybody this, the whole goddamn system's going to collapse, because we're still acknowledging that people are responding to stimulus and to incentives, right? So if we remove, say, like fear of punitive elements, like if you go commit robbery or whatever, and we're not going to throw you in jail anymore, are we going to just unleash the purge? What happens?
No, because for one thing, like you could take a sea snail, a sea slug, and teach it to learn something. It could learn to retract this part of its body when you bop it on the head with something. And like this God in my field got a Nobel Prize figuring out every single neuron and every molecule that does that. And we've got the same in us. We've got the exact same chemicals that mediate sea slug learning and changing of behavior. And it's the same in us. And sometimes, you need to bop somebody over the head because that shapes their behavior in a purely instrumental way. And sometimes you say to somebody in front of the whole 5th grade class, great job on that, in a purely instrumental way, but don't believe they have a soul anywhere in there and don't believe they've earned it. You're just doing that because sometimes that's an effective way of doing it. But what you bring up is like, oh my God, what if people started believing this? The easiest version of that panic is, wow, people will just run amok, and because there's no constraints, and society won't try to constrain them because you can't put somebody in jail because they did something bad, or you can't invite somebody to dinner because they like belched a lot at dinner and this is their punishment. People will just run amok. People won't run amok. An interesting scientific literature showed if you prompt people to believe less in free will in some little experimental setting, they're more likely to cheat in a economic game 2 minutes afterward. Whoa, that's it. We're all going to run amok. But then you look more closely and you look at people who show up in that psych lab who already don't believe in free will, and they're just as ethical as the people saying, I am the captain of my ship and I have my conscience or my Lord to answer to. And the exact same equivalent is, okay, the running amok with no free will is because I can't be held responsible. The other version of that is running amok because there's nobody to ultimately hold me responsible. Oh, those atheists who are immoral, you look at people who have thought long and hard and are, stridently atheistic, and you look at people who have thought long and hard and have come out with a stridently observed religious framework for their morality, and they're both equally ethical in their behavior. And the key thing there is they're more ethical than the people in between who are saying, yeah, I guess I believe in God, but I don't think about it much, but the kids should probably learn some of the traditions, or, yeah, I don't believe in God, I don't think about it, whatever, I'm apathetic. And it's the ones who are in between that you see priming one direction or the other that could make them more or less ethical. The people, whether you sit there and you think long and hard and you have some sleepless nights and worry about what it all means and conclude there's a God who loves me or who is watching me, or there's somebody who's going to throw lightning bolts at me, or you conclude it is an empty, pointless universe. If you've thought long and hard about that, you're thinking long and hard about where human morality comes from. What are the sources of our goodness and all of that? And what study after study shows is if that's the process you've gone through, it doesn't even matter what answer you've got, you're going to be highly ethical. And you even look at these.
My personal life bears that out. I was super religious when I was in high school and college, and I no longer am, and I don't think I've murdered a single person.
There you go.
My vantage point is it'd be great if it turns out that there's a point to all of this, and that the universe is guided by love, and there's an afterlife. Sounds wonderful. I hope that's the case. If it's not, I'm just doing nice stuff for free. You get it for free. I'm not even worried. I'm not doing it for fear of punishment or hope of reward. I'm just doing it because it seems like a good thing to do. Now, that being said, and I think that most people would fall into that category. I think that the vast majority of the human experiment or the human species is operating on a spectrum of benign neutrality to altruism at most times. Would you still have prison? Would you still have a criminal justice system? Is it just that you would lose the punitive element, or would you get rid of the system as a whole?
Well, this is then where one easily freaks out. But no, you wouldn't have a criminal justice system. You wouldn't have prisons. Oh my God, this guy, I thought he was just a bleeding heart liberal jerk. He's completely over the top with this. No prisons anymore. If you have a car and its brakes don't work and you don't know how to fix it, drive the car. You don't let it out on the street because it's dangerous. You put it in a garage and you don't use it. But you don't preach to the car about how it deserves to not be able to take a drive on a Sunday. If your kid has a runny nose, you don't want to get everybody else in kindergarten sick, and you quarantine them. You keep them home, but you don't tell them that Satan is making their nose run. And with both the car and the kid with a runny nose, you figure out what's the absolute minimum I need to do to keep this car from being dangerous or from my kid sneezing on everybody at school, and do that, and don't do an inch beyond that because there's no retribution, no deserve anywhere in that. I am going to take a pause here because I see my golden retriever,
the dog.
His ball has rolled onto the couch and he is frantic and can't.
Go for it. No, go for it. Yeah.
And of course, as a golden retriever, the ball was like 2 inches under the couch and he could have gotten it easily. But of course, he thinks he's completely helpless, and he uses the unique muscles that dogs have evolved that they'll have to arch his eyebrows up because of evolutionary constraints on domestication. And I look at that and I say, oh my God, I need to go get his ball for him and then feed him and then buy Halloween costumes for him. Whether we're trying to figure out why did that dog just bark, or why did that person just do something wonderful or awful, in all those cases, it's because of 1 second before and 1 minute before and a million years before and everything in between.
So to go back to the prison example you gave, or the child with the runny nose or the car that doesn't work, one of my friends is an economist that has a wealth of knowledge in criminal justice. And she, I don't know if she came up with this phrase, but she told me we put two types of people in prison: people we're afraid of and people we're angry at. And so you would basically go, it make maybe not prison explicitly, it does make sense to take dangerous people and hold them away from society. Like that ought to be there. But the idea of doing it because we're mad at the person would be immoral, because ultimately there is an obligation to protect society, but the idea that there's some sort of soul that needs to be tortured as recompense, that bit is medieval thinking.
Yeah, exactly. And it is so hard because we like to punish, and we get crazed at people who have done hugely damaging things, and it makes it impossible for us to see. You only get that way if you're damaged, blah, blah, all of that. But yeah, do the absolute minimum. Put them on an island of misfit toys or something, and they can stay there, but keep everyone else safe from them. But then there's this massive implication that I'm kicking myself because I didn't emphasize this anywhere near enough in the book. It's the same exact thing with a meritocracy. You don't want to have dangerous, murderous people running around on the street. You want to, protect society from them, but don't tell them they earned the minimal quarantine things you've constrained them with to keep them from being dangerous. You don't want incompetent people doing brain surgery on you. You want to protect people from that. You want to have well-trained neurosurgeons and well-trained judges adjudicating over things and well-trained everything. But you don't tell them at that point that they have earned the extra prestige that they get because they haven't. And maybe you don't tell them that they've earned their extra salary. And maybe if we're really going to get nutty here, maybe they don't get a bigger salary. But just as it makes no sense at all to have a criminal justice system that's predicated on blame and punishment and retribution, it makes no sense to have a meritocracy that's predicated on praise and reward. Yeah, have dangerous people not be dangerous and have competent people run our world, but it's not because either of them deserve to be in the position they're in.
So I can once again default. I don't know I was going to talk about Greek philosophy very much today, but to default again on Greek philosophy, if we were to go back to the period of Socrates, he would have his ilk would have said that if you're writing a book and it's really good, it's because there was a genius or a daemon or something, that there was a spiritual entity like a muse which compelled you to write this particular book. If the book went really well, really didn't have much to do with you. You were just a vehicle for the daemon that was writing it. If it went really poorly, don't feel bad. Your muse sucked. Your muse was feeling anemic that day. And so you're almost describing a system where, if you write a really good book, get money on the book. It's a good book. People want the book. We want to encourage people to write good books. But kind of the psychic payoff that might accompany it, we'd be like, don't get a big head. You get a big salary because we want to incentivize competent people to be neurosurgeons. But we're not going to pretend like there's something spiritually superior about you to somebody that's a janitor.
Yeah. And when you put those pieces together at the blame punishment end and at the praise reward end and put all of it together, none of us are entitled to anything more than anyone else. There is no person who is less entitled to having their needs be considered than you are, because none of it makes sense. Yeah. Once again, I can think that way 1/10 of 1% of the time, but that is the only, neurobiologically, sociologically, social worker, anthropology, ecology stance to get to, and it's the only ethical one, because all we are is the end product of the luck over which we had no control, the biological and the environmental luck. And we are raised in a society to think we deserve whatever it is we've gotten as a result. If we were Puritans, we would believe in predestination, and we would believe that there was no volition on our parts and everything was like God turning the levers. So we've got biological ones now, but none of us have earned anything that we or society views us as entitled to.
It would be like you won the tallest kid in your class contest. Yes, you're the tallest, but it's not as if there's any actual merit to it. It's just that was what your genes were. Congratulations. Okay, so I'm mostly with you. And say with criminal justice, for example, I'm very Swedish in my criminal justice position. That is to say that I want criminal justice to be primarily rehabilitative. I want to protect the public. I want to rehabilitate the prisoners, which is also good, by the way, for the average taxpayer. It's better to have a lower recidivism rate. So these are all good things. And I would mark punishment as lowest in terms of what I want, if at all. But there are fringe cases I can think of. So most of the time, you commit a crime, the punishment insofar as it exists in Sweden is you are now in a facility where you can't hurt anybody, and we're going to try to provide you with psychological counseling and GEDs. All that's good to me, right? But on the fringe, though, let's say we get a serial killer who's killed 15 people and really enjoyed it and drug it out and liked it, and we can give him a pill where he'll never commit murder again, and we'll keep him under surveillance. I don't think I'd feel comfortable letting the guy go without some level of punishment. I feel like if somebody's truly deriving that pleasure from committing heinous crimes, then I kind of do want to have some punishment there. I wouldn't do it with tax evasion, but with torture I would.
And in addition, we'd probably even come up with this philosophical song and dance that like Clockwork Orange, which is ancient movie by now, had as this theme that it doesn't really count if he's being a good boy. It doesn't really count if you conditioned him to that point, because you intervened and made him what he's not really, his essence, his soul, his ember of individuality. There's that as well. But what you bring up is the biggest problem. We like to punish. People activate reward parts of the brain when they punish righteously. And like what I've spent like a lot of time thinking through is nonetheless over and over and over the centuries, we've shown we can subtract out viewing someone as being responsible when something bad happens, something damaging happens, and the roof doesn't cave in. We have figured out that like old women missing teeth and with goiters don't cause hailstorms. We don't burn witches anymore. We figured out that
we're teenagers. We literally put teenagers in a different legal jurisdiction than we do adults because it's not just that you're younger and you don't have a wealth of knowledge. Your brain's not done developing. You don't have the prefrontal cortex fully developed, which means you have impulse control problems. Your hippocampus probably isn't fully developed, which means you can't contextualize risk-seeking behavior and social approbation as well as an adult can. Therefore, you're going to make dumbass decisions. So if a 16-year-old does something stupid, we're going to treat him different than a 40-year-old.
Exactly, except that's still with a reformist agenda. That's saying he's not there yet to be able to be held fully responsible, or he shouldn't be because he had his frontal cortex damage. That's like the same thing as saying we're not going to burn this person at the stake because, after all, she was only 15 when she caused the hailstorm. Her prefrontal cortex isn't fully developed. That's a reformist one. That's taking as your starting point.
Got it. Because I'm presupposing once your prefrontal cortex is developed, you are now morally culpable for your actions.
It's saying we have free will. Sometimes we don't, if you're really tired or your brain's been damaged. And there's some people who never have it because they had some unspeakable upbringing. But all of that was in the backdrop of, those are the exceptions. Those are the mitigating circumstances. Like, remember, give the kid who's having trouble learning in your classroom, give them extra types of reward instead of the gold stars you had to the other kids because they have dyslexia. And so, you got to do something. Keep that in mind amid our world of believing in free will. Like, be conscious of the ones where we can imagine, we even know where the constraints have occurred. And that's just reformist, because all you're doing is like ignoring the rest of the landscape of how did you become you because of what came before, and before that, and before that.
You mentioned earlier that you've done a lot of work in court cases where you're an expert witness, I assume, and you're weighing in as a neurologist in terms of criminals. I think I know the answer to this question, but to confirm, do violent criminals have a higher correlation with head trauma than nonviolent criminals? And the reason I ask this is I am less inclined towards the let people off because they had a bad childhood. That seems to me like kind of a logical fallacy based on sympathy, which I don't want to operate from. But if you're saying like, no, they literally have a head condition, that I'm much more amenable to.
Because like that one, you can show somebody a brain scan, and you got the brain scan from a machine that cost you $1 million. So it's much more believable. In both of those cases, it's the exact same thing, but it's much harder to see where the little nudges and influences. Yeah, the guy had his frontal cortex knocked out, 25% of it, and no wonder. And what the studies show is something like 1/3 to 75% of men on death row have a history of concussive head trauma to the front of their heads, the frontal cortex. Whoa, these are not crummy souls. You just screwed up the brakes on the system. So it's easy to imagine that when there was the car accident, and here's the brain scan and all of that. It's harder to imagine it when you find out Yeah, got shuttled from foster home to foster home, was sexually abused in a whole lot of them. The mother drank a lot of alcohol when she was pregnant, so there's elements of fetal alcohol. And they have a screwed up frontal cortex just as clearly, but the way it got there was just little bits, 1,000 cuts. Yeah, that time that they got sexually abused. Yeah, that time they saw somebody shot on the street. Yeah, that time they had gone 3 days without eating because mom had spent the grocery money for her crack. Whatever it is, that's just harder to see something big and dramatic caused by 1,000 little nudges. Yeah, car accident. That makes sense. Okay. Yeah, that I can work with.
I got it. So this is kind of like I can look at somebody with a broken leg and go, well, of course he can't race. Well, he's got a broken leg. But if I looked at somebody with dyslexia and went, just goddamn try harder, it's the fact that I can't visibly see it, that it's not a readily apparent manifestation, rather it's something more subtle, does not negate the fact that there's also a biological, neurochemical, or physical condition that's resulting in that. And that looking at the one and saying, I do not hold you accountable for your broken leg, but then looking at somebody with a any neurological formation to go, well, I do hold you accountable. It's just me failing to appreciate subtlety.
Exactly. And at some point, it stops being neurological with the implications being disease. At some point, it becomes all of us on our continua. And it's hardest to do in that realm where we all make this false dichotomy that's so hard to fight. Yeah, it's biological that this person has the right neurotransmitter receptors, so they've got good digit span memory, or this person has the right height so they could play in the NBA. Yeah, that's biological. That they had no control over. But it's what they do with it. Did they show self-discipline? Did they show backbone? Did they squander their gifts? Did they that's got nothing to do with biology. That's where we're talking about sort of the fairy dust of backbone and get up and go when the going gets tough kind of stuff, or did you just indulge yourself and squander away your gifts? And that's this critical dichotomy that people falsely make. Willpower, or giving into temptation, all of that is made of atoms and made of neurons and made of neurochemicals in the exact same way as is the ability of, some people could answer questions on Jeopardy faster than other people. Here's the machinery that explains it, over which they had no control, and here's how they got there. And some people can have the genes predisposing towards alcoholism, and every single time make the wrong decision, or every single time order ginger ale. And it's not by chance that each one of those became that person with their backbone or lack thereof. It's the exact same thing. It is nuts and bolts. We're all made of cells kind of stuff as to why we can't will ourselves to have willpower, and why some people at junctions make the right decisions, and the ones who, every single time they're going to do the impulsive destructive thing, and you can bet on it. It is not by chance. You're not looking at differences in character or the measure of a man or his soul or whatever, things like that. It's the exact same nuts and bolts that make up whether or not you steal something if nobody's looking, or whether or not you're willing to put yourself in danger to help somebody else, or whether or not you can feel the pain of somebody who doesn't look like you or pray like you or eat like you, or whether or not you immediately feel hostile to them because there's something you just get in the pit of your stomach. It's wrong that they dress that way. And none of these are by chance.
We'll wrap up in a second. I've got a couple more questions for you. I want to pelt the final ancient world reference at you since I want to kick today.
Okay.
My favorite Roman emperor is Claudius. He probably had it's not multiple sclerosis. There's a particular neurological condition that makes people have a palsy. He probably had palsy. Yep. He drooled. He shook a lot. And Tiberius, his uncle, and his grandmother and his mother were horrible to him because he would shake and he would drool, and they would like smack him around and be like, if you would just try harder, you'd stop doing this. And they literally perceived his neurological problem as a lack of will. And it sounds to me like you're basically going with the same recoil that listeners are probably having right now to thinking about somebody smacking somebody around with palsy, viewing it as a character defect, that we will eventually get to that way in society where we'll view smacking people around in general on the premise that they lacked grit or they had faulty character as equally ridiculous, that it all boils down to neurological makeup.
And ultimately equally ridiculous to say to somebody else, wow, nice haircut, or nice moral act that you did, or nice SAT scores. It's the exact same stuff. And it makes as little sense. And again, like, I think this way since I was 14, and I can't act this way 99% of the time. And it seems inconceivable, but look at what people thought 100 years ago was just self-evident. And look at what people 200 years ago, some people are simply intrinsically appropriate for slavery. And look at 500 years ago, and some people have Satan. And in all these cases, we figured out mothers don't cause schizophrenia. We figured out kids who reverse letters when they're trying to learn to read have something screwed with one part of their cortex. Over and over and over, we've learned to subtract out responsibility, and the roof hasn't caved in, and the world has become more humane. And the fact that we can't imagine doing it with the stuff that we judge and praise and reward now just means that we're stuck in this time and place, and like, make the effort to be one of the people that they're not going to be looking back on 100 years from now and saying, can you believe they still thought that way? Can you believe people's lives were ruined, or people's lives were pickled in privilege because of stuff they had absolutely nothing to do with? Thank God we've got a more humane planet. Go do the effort to make that happen a little faster. And maybe not when, like, as to whether or not, don't praise them for their nice shirt, but maybe don't praise them for being a CEO of a corporation. And don't, like, it's okay to blame somebody if they just, like, drop the dinner plate or whatever, but maybe don't do it when you're deciding whether or not they are going to be electrocuted. If it's hard to do, at least save the work for the cases where it really matters.
My guess is that I am keeping you from another interview, given that the book is coming out soon. So I'll go ahead and wrap it up there. You've given me much to think about, and I very much enjoyed this. Thank you very much, Dr. Sapulsky, for coming on.
Likewise, total blast. Thank you for
excuse me, Sapulsky.
Oh, it took me just to pronounce it right anyway, so that's okay. Well, good. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It was wonderful to talk to you. And once again, the book is Determined, A Science of Life Without Free Will. As I mentioned at the beginning of the program, it is very accessible to those of us that are not neuroscientists. It's also pretty funny. And for anybody whose blood is really boiling, you should definitely read this book because I think all of the emails I'm about to get of why didn't he bring up this thing probably covered in the book, but we certainly didn't have time to hit it. But I enjoyed our conversation. Thank you.
Likewise. Okay. Take care. Have a good day. Have a good life.
Hey, real quick. I don't know why the hell I talked about ancient philosophy so much today, but for some reason I fixated on that. And anyway, I made a funny sketch about Socrates several years ago. At least I think it's funny. And it seems pertinent today, given all the weird ancient philosophy I slipped into. If you'd like to see that, you can check today's episode description. You'll find a funny YouTube video I made with some friends. If you'd like to learn more about the Emperor Claudius, my favorite emperor, fun fact, he once fought a whale. We covered him on my history podcast, Losers, Pretenders, and Scoundrels, and I have included a link to that in the episode description as well. And, as always, if you enjoy the show, please check out patreon.com/Andrew Heaton, where you can show me some love and enjoy you some bonus episodes. Thanks. That's the show. Thanks for listening. Thank you, Robert Sapulsky, for coming on to talk about free will. Thank you, Eric Stipe, who edited today's episode. And thank you, glorious patrons who make it all possible. Until next time, I've been Andrew Heaton, and so have you.